January 14, 1755. A young woman's body was found on the road between Leeds and Armley. Her clothes were torn. Her skin was shredded. The marks on her wrists told investigators she'd been tied to something. The trail of blood stretched nearly half a mile. Within days, magistrates arrested William Salisbury, a gentleman of considerable wealth and standing. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses came forward. A jury heard the case. And on April 23, 1755, they found him guilty of murder. He was convicted. The sentence should have been death. But William Salisbury walked out of that courtroom a free man. His punishment? Postponed. The judge suspended his sentence until Salisbury turned 99 years old. The victim's name was Anna Dorothea Swarts. She was 22 years old. She worked as a domestic servant in Salisbury's household. And for more than 2.5 centuries, almost nobody remembered she existed. This is her story. This is the story of how a wealthy man bought his way out of a murder conviction. And this is the story of how justice in 18th century England had a price tag that most people couldn't afford. Because what happened in Leeds in 1755 wasn't an anomaly. It was the system working exactly as designed. Before we can understand what happened to Anna Dorothea Swarts, we need to understand who she was, and that's harder than it should be. In 1755, domestic servants like Anna didn't leave much behind. No diaries, no letters. Their lives were lived in the margins of other people's stories. What we know about Anna comes mostly from legal records, court documents, witness testimonies, the paperwork generated by her death. She was born Anna Dorothea Swarts, likely in Leeds or the surrounding area. Parish records suggest she came from a working family. Her father may have been a laborer or tradesman. By her early 20s, she'd entered domestic service, which was one of the few employment options available to young women of her class. Domestic service in Georgian England was grueling work. Servants rose before dawn and worked until late evening. They cleaned, cooked, hauled water, tended fires, served meals, laundered clothes. A maidservant like Anna might earn 4 to 6 pounds a year, barely enough to survive on. Room and board were included, but that meant living in cramped quarters, often in attics or basements, entirely at the mercy of your employer. And here's what made their position so precarious. Servants had almost no legal protections. You could be dismissed without notice. Your employer controlled not just your work, but your entire life. Where you went, who you spoke to, what you ate. If your employer decided to withhold your wages, you had almost no recourse.
The relationship between master and servant in the 18th century was fundamentally unequal. The law recognized servants as dependents of the household head, almost like children. They had certain rights in theory, but enforcing those rights required access to the legal system.
Anna worked in the household of William Salisbury. We don't know exactly what her role was: lady's maid, housemaid, kitchen servant. The records don't say. What we do know is that by January 1755, she was living under his roof, subject to his authority, and completely dependent on his goodwill for her survival. She was 22 years old, and she had about 2 weeks left to live. William Salisbury was everything Anna Dorothea Swarts was not. Wealthy, connected, protected by a social system that treated men of his class as fundamentally different from and superior to everyone else. The Salisbury family owned land in and around Leeds. Property ownership in 18th century England wasn't just about wealth, it was about power. Landowners controlled local politics. They served as magistrates and justices of the peace. They had the right to vote at a time when the vast majority of the population did not. William Salisbury moved through a world where his word carried weight, where his social connections opened doors, where the law in many ways existed to protect people like him and control people like Anna. Class in Georgian England wasn't subtle. It was written into everything. How you dressed, how you spoke, where you lived, who you could marry, what kind of work you could do. The gentry occupied a completely different legal and social universe from their servants. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before there was a trial, before there were lawyers and judges and negotiations, there was a crime, and it happened on a cold January night in 1755.
What exactly happened on the night Anna Dorothea Swarts died is documented in court records, witness statements, and coroner's reports. But those documents are clinical. They reduce a human life to evidence. So let me tell you what we know, and what those dry legal records actually mean. On the evening of January 14th, something happened at the Salisbury residence. We don't know what triggered the confrontation. The records don't tell us whether Anna had done something William Salisbury perceived as an offense, or whether this was premeditated, or whether it was simply an escalation of ongoing abuse. What we know is this: William Salisbury tied Anna Dorothea Swarts to his horse. The testimony indicates she was bound by the wrists to the saddle or stirrup leathers. And then he rode. He rode from his property toward Armley, dragging her behind him. The road between Leeds and Armley wasn't paved. It was dirt and stones and frozen mud. Witnesses who saw the aftermath said the trail of blood could be traced for nearly half a mile. At some point, we don't know, when Anna Dorothea Swarts died, whether from the trauma of being dragged, from exposure, from injuries sustained when she hit stones or other obstacles. The records don't specify. What they do specify is that when her body was found the next morning, the evidence was unmistakable. Her clothing was shredded. Her body bore injuries consistent with being dragged over rough ground at speed. The rope marks on her wrists were deep and clear. There was no question about how she died. The only question was who was responsible. A passing traveler found Anna's body on the morning of January 15th. Withinol's local magistrates were notified. And this is where we see the wheels of Georgian justice begin to turn. In 1755, investigating a suspicious death followed a specific procedure. First, a coroner would be summoned to examine the body and determine cause of death. Then, if foul play was suspected, an inquest would be held. Local men property owners, not a representative jury, would be assembled to hear evidence and deliver a verdict. The inquest into Anna Dorothea Swarts' death didn't take long. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses came forward. People who'd seen Salisbury ride out that evening. People who'd heard screams. People who'd noticed Anna's absence from the household. And then there was the physical evidence. The rope marks. The injuries. The trail that led directly back toward Salisbury's property. The horse, still in his stable, with evidence of blood on its tack. 18th century investigations were more sophisticated than we often give them credit for. They didn't have forensic science as we understand it, but they understood physical evidence. Coroners examined bodies carefully. They documented injuries. They connected evidence to suspects. The challenge wasn't usually gathering evidence. It was getting justice for victims who lacked social power. On January 20th, 1755, 6 days after Anna's death, the coroner's inquest delivered its verdict. Anna Dorothea Swarts had been murdered, and William Salisbury was formally accused of her murder. Salisbury was arrested and held for trial. In cases of murder, bail was rarely granted. He would have been confined or given his status, probably not in the same conditions as a common criminal. More likely under house arrests or in relatively comfortable quarters befitting a gentleman. The trial was set for April 1755 at the York Assembly. The assizes were traveling courts where serious criminal cases were heard. Judges from London would circuit through regions like Yorkshire, hearing cases of murder, theft, and other major crimes. And this is where the real story begins. Because the investigation was straightforward, the evidence was clear. The verdict, as we'll see, was never really in doubt. What was in doubt was whether justice would actually be served. The trial of William Salisbury would expose something that everyone in Georgia and England already knew but rarely spoke about openly. The law was for sale. Justice was negotiable, and if you had enough money, enough connections, enough power, you could buy your way out of almost anything, even murder. January in Yorkshire is bitter. In 1755, the winter was particularly harsh. The ground froze hard. Roads turned treacherous. People stayed indoors when they could, huddled near fires, waiting for spring. On the evening of January 14th, the sun set just after 4 o'clock. By 5, it was fully dark. Cold. The kind of cold that burns your lungs when you breathe. We don't know exactly what happened inside the Salisbury household that evening. The trial records don't give us a clear answer. No one testified to witnessing the initial confrontation. What we have are fragments of a story that ended in violence. What we do know comes from what happened next. At some point that evening, William Salisbury went to his stable. He saddled his horse, and he brought Dorothea Swarts with him. The testimony presented at trial was specific. Salisbury bound Anna's wrists. The method was deliberate, tight enough that she couldn't free herself, secured to the saddle in a way that would hold her weight as the horse moved. And then he rode out of his property onto the road that led toward Armley. It wasn't a short ride. It wasn't a moment of anger that passed quickly. The evidence showed he dragged down Dorothea Swarts for nearly half a mile. Think about that distance. Half a mile. At walking pace, that's about 10 minutes. At a trot, maybe 5 to 10 minutes of being pulled across frozen ground. Across stones, through over ruts, left by cartwheels. The coroner who examined Anna's body documented her injuries in detail. Abrasions covering most of her body, deep rope burns on her wrists. Evidence of blunt force trauma, consistent with striking solid objects at speed. Exposure to extreme cold. At some point during that journey, Dorothea Swarts died. The exact moment isn't recorded. There's no medical precision about when her heart stopped, when she lost consciousness, when the trauma became too much. What we know is that when the sun rose on January 15th, 1755, her body was found on the road between Leeds and Armley. A man named Thomas Hickson found her. He was traveling on foot from Leeds toward Armley early that morning. In his later testimony, he said he saw what he thought was a bundle of clothes lying at the side of the road. When he got closer, he realized it was a person. Hickson later testified that he could see immediately she was dead. He didn't move the body. Instead, he went directly to the nearest magistrate, a man named Robert Denison, reported what he'd found. This is where we see 18th century justice beginning to function. Denison acted quickly. By mid-morning, he dispatched the coroner, a man named John Wilson. Wilson arrived at the scene around 10 o'clock, accompanied by 2 parish officials and several men to serve as witnesses. Wilson's examination was thorough. He documented the location where the body was found. He noted the condition of the clothing torn severely, particularly on the back and sides. He examined the injuries, and he found something that immediately suggested this wasn't an accident. The rope marks on Anna's wrists were unmistakable. Deep grooves, skin abraded in a pattern consistent with sustained tension. Wilson noted in his report that the marks indicated she'd been bound tightly and had struggled against the restraints. What's remarkable about this case is how much physical evidence the investigators documented. They didn't have modern forensic techniques, obviously, but they understood how to read a body. Coroners in the 1750s were trained to look for specific signals. Death instantaneous or prolonged. Were there defensive wounds? What did the injuries tell you about how they were inflicted? In Anna Swarts' case, the evidence was clear. This wasn't an accident. This was sustained, deliberate violence. But documenting the evidence was only the first step. Wilson needed to determine who was responsible, and this is where witness testimony became crucial. Within 2 days, several people had come forward. A man named Joseph Bradley testified that he seen William Salisbury riding toward Armley on the evening of January 14th. Bradley said Salisbury was riding unusually fast, and he'd heard what sounded like something being dragged behind the horse. Another witness, Sarah Metcalf, was more direct. She testified that she'd heard screaming coming from the direction of the Salisbury property that evening. High-pitched, desperate. She'd assumed it was an animal in distress and hadn't investigated further. When she learned of Anna's death the next day, she realized what she'd actually heard. News traveled fast in a community the size of Leeds. By January 16th, everyone knew that Dorothea Swarts was dead. Everyone knew how she died, and everyone knew that William Salisbury had been arrested. The reaction tells us something important about how this case was perceived. People were shocked, yes, but they weren't entirely surprised that a gentleman had killed a servant. What surprised them was that he was being held accountable for it. On January 20th, 6 days after Anna's death, Coroner Wilson convened a formal inquest. 12 local Menol property owners, as the law required, assembled to hear the evidence and deliver a verdict. They heard from Thomas Hickson, who'd found the body. They heard from Joseph Bradley and Sarah Metcalf about what they'd seen and heard. They examined the physical evidence of the rope marks, the injuries, the torn clothing, and they heard testimony about Anna's position in the Salisbury household, her character, her circumstances. The jury's deliberation didn't take long. By the end of the day, they'd reached their conclusion. Anna Dorothea Swarts had died of injuries sustained while being dragged behind a horse, and William Salisbury had caused her death. The verdict was willful murder. Salisbury was formally charged and committed for trial. In ordinary circumstances, he would have been held in the county jail until the next assessment. But these weren't ordinary circumstances. Salisbury was wealthy. He was connected, and within days, his lawyers had secured different arrangements. He was placed under house arrest, confined to his property, but not to a cell. He could continue to manage his affairs, consult with his attorneys, and prepare his defense. Meanwhile, Anna Dorothea Swarts lay in an unmarked grave in a Leeds churchyard. The trial was set for April at the York Assembly. 3 months away. 3 months for. For Salisbury's lawyers to work, 3 months for evidence to be reviewed, witnesses to be prepared, and strategies to be developed, and 3 months for everyone involved to understand that this case was going to be about more than just what happened on that January night. It was going to be about whether the law meant the same thing for everyone, or whether justice, like everything else in Georgian England, was for sale.